The economic plans are approved. Obywatele polscy!
What if you could travel back in time to 1939, armed with the knowledge of everything that was about to happen? What would you tell the people of Europe as they stood on the edge of the abyss? Would you warn them about the 60 million souls who would never see 1945? Would you describe the cities reduced to rubble, the families torn apart, the industrial scale of slaughter that was about to consume their world? Now consider this. The man responsible for it all, the man who would unleash this horror, had already written down his entire plan 14 years earlier. He had told the world exactly what he intended to do, and in the end, they still could not believe he meant it. The deadliest conflict in human history, the war that redrew the maps of continents and ushered in the atomic age, was it all just a tragic accident? A series of unfortunate events and diplomatic miscalculations that spiraled hopelessly out of control. For decades, this question has haunted historians and everyday people alike. Was there a moment, a single decision, that could have changed everything? The evidence, when you lay it all out from beginning to end, points to a conclusion that is both disturbing and undeniable. World War II in Europe was not an accident. It was not a mistake. It was a deliberate strategy, crafted in the mind of one man and executed by a regime that had prepared for this moment from the very beginning. Adolf Hitler did not stumble into war. He ran toward it with his eyes wide open. Every rearmament program, every propaganda campaign, every territorial demand, and every diplomatic bluff was a calculated step on a path he had mapped out years before he even came to power. This episode will take you on that journey from the ashes of one war to the opening shots of the next. We will examine how the Nazi state oriented its entire economy toward the singular goal of conquest. We will explore why the regime believed it had a shrinking window of opportunity to act, a window that would close forever by 1943 or 1945. And we will walk through the diplomatic escalations that tested the limits of the world's patience. From the reoccupation of the Rhineland to the annexation of Austria, from the betrayal at Munich to the impossible pact with Stalin. By the time we reach the first shots fired over the Polish city of Danzig, you will understand that this was not a war that simply happened. It was a war that was chosen. Before we continue, make sure to smash both the like and hype buttons and subscribe to our channel for more ominous history videos. We greatly appreciate your support. 1919. Why the Treaty of Versailles guaranteed another war. To truly understand why Germany started World War II, you must first travel back to a quiet room in the Palace of Versailles in June of 1919. Inside the Hall of Mirrors, a place where German emperors had once celebrated their own glory, a defeated German delegation was about to be handed a document. It was a document so harsh, so humiliating, that even some Allied generals warned it would only plant the seeds for another conflict. The German delegates were not allowed to negotiate. They were given a simple choice: sign the treaty or face the immediate invasion of their country. When they finally put pen to paper, they did so with the knowledge that they were signing away not just territory, but the soul of their nation. The Treaty of Versailles did far more than simply end the state of war. It was designed to crush Germany so thoroughly that it could never threaten peace again. Article 231, the infamous War Guilt Clause, forced Germany to accept full responsibility for causing the war. This single clause was not just a matter of pride, it was the legal justification for everything else. Because Germany was guilty, Germany had to pay. And pay they did. The reparations were set at the astronomical sum of 132 billion gold marks, a debt so massive that it would take generations to pay off. But the treaty also stripped Germany of its industrial heartland. The Saar Basin, with its rich coalfields, was placed under international control. The province of Alsace-Lorraine was returned to France. And in the east, the newly resurrected nation of Poland was given access to the sea through a strip of land known as the Polish Corridor, which physically separated East Prussia from the rest of Germany. For the German people, this was a national humiliation that burned itself into the collective memory. The German army was reduced to a mere 100,000 men, barely enough to guard its own borders, let alone defend the nation. The navy was scuttled or surrendered, and the air force, the Luftwaffe, was banned entirely. The Rhineland, the industrial backbone of Germany, was to be permanently demilitarized, meaning no German soldier could even set foot there. To add insult to injury, Germany was excluded from the new League of Nations, treated as a pariah state unworthy of a seat at the table of civilized nations. The message was clear. Germany was not just defeated, it was an outcast. The economic consequences were catastrophic. Throughout the early 1920s, Germany struggled to make its reparation payments. When it fell behind, French and Belgian troops marched into the Ruhr Valley, Germany's industrial engine, and occupied it. The German government responded by printing money to pay the workers who had gone on strike, and the result was hyperinflation of a scale that is almost impossible to comprehend. People carried wheelbarrows full of cash just to buy a loaf of bread. Life savings were wiped out overnight. Middle-class families who had trusted their government found themselves destitute. This was the world into which extremist political movements were born. When the economy finally stabilized in the mid-20s, it was only a temporary respite. The Great Depression hit Germany harder than almost any other nation, and by the early 1930s, millions of Germans were out of work, hungry, and desperate for someone to blame. That someone was the Treaty of Versailles. The Nazis did not create the resentment, but they mastered it. They promised to tear up the treaty, to restore German honor, to rebuild the military, and to unite all German-speaking people under one flag. These were not fringe ideas. They were the deepest desires of a nation that felt it had been wronged by the world. The treaty had guaranteed that Germany would eventually rise again, not because it was just, but because it was so punitive that it created a nation of revanchists. The question was never whether Germany would try to overturn Versailles. The question was how far they would go when they finally did. 1925. Living space. Hitler's blueprint for conquest. While Germany was still picking up the pieces from hyperinflation and economic collapse, a man sat in a prison cell in the Bavarian city of Landsberg am Lech. His name was Adolf Hitler, and he had just failed in a ridiculous attempt to overthrow the government in a beer hall putsch. Most people assumed his political career was finished, but Hitler was using his time in prison to do something far more dangerous than plotting coups. He was writing a book. That book, dictated to his loyal deputy Rudolf Hess, would eventually be published as 2 volumes under the title Mein Kampf, which translates to My Struggle. And within its pages, hidden behind rambling prose and anti-Semitic rants, was a detailed blueprint for the war that would consume the world. The core concept of Mein Kampf, the idea that drove everything else, was something Hitler called Lebensraum. It is a German word that means living space. But for Hitler, it meant something far more sinister. He argued that the German people, whom he considered the master race, were destined to expand. They needed more land to support their growing population, land that would allow them to become self-sufficient and compete with the great world powers like the British Empire and the United States. But Hitler was not looking for colonies in Africa or Asia. He looked east. The land he wanted belonged to the Soviet Union and the Slavic peoples who lived there, peoples he considered subhuman, fit only to be enslaved or driven out. This was not simply a return to the borders of 1914. This was a vision of racial imperialism that went far beyond anything the Kaiser had ever imagined. Hitler wrote that Germany would either be a world power or it would cease to exist. And to be a world power, it needed the vast agricultural lands of Ukraine and the oil fields of the Caucasus. He saw history as a Darwinian struggle, a constant fight for survival in which the strong conquered the weak. Peace was not the natural state of affairs. War was. And the next war, the inevitable war, would decide the fate of the German race for the next 1,000 years. What makes Mein Kampf so chilling is its honesty. Hitler did not hide his intentions behind diplomatic language. He spelled out his foreign policy goals in black and white. He explicitly stated that Germany must resume its march along the road of the Teutonic Knights, acquiring the land that had been wrested from the Slavs centuries before. He denounced the idea of simply restoring the borders of 1914 as a crime, an inadequate goal that would only lead to another defeat. The only solution was expansion, permanent expansion, secured by the sword. For years, foreign leaders dismissed Mein Kampf as the ravings of a lunatic, the kind of nonsense a failed politician writes when he thinks no one is listening. They assumed that if Hitler ever came to power, the responsibilities of government would tame his radical ideas. They could not have been more wrong. For Hitler, Mein Kampf was not just a memoir. It was his political testament, a sacred text that he believed contained the future of Germany. Once in power, he did not abandon these ideas. He simply waited for the right moment to put them into action. The plan was there from the very beginning. All that remained was to build the machine that could carry it out. 1933 to 1934. Destroying democracy to build a war machine. Before Hitler could conquer Europe, he first had to destroy Germany from within. The democracy he sought to dismantle was called the Weimar Republic, a fragile experiment in self-government that had been born in the ashes of the First World War. By January of 1933, the Republic was already on life support, weakened by economic depression, political violence, and a public that had lost all faith in its institutions. When President Paul von Hindenburg, the aging hero of the previous war, reluctantly appointed Hitler as Chancellor, few imagined how quickly the end would come. Within months, the Republic would be dead, and in its place would rise a dictatorship built for one purpose: war. The turning point came on the night of February 27th, 1933. The Reichstag building, the home of the German parliament, went up in flames. A Dutch communist named Marinus van der Lubbe was found at the scene and arrested. To this day, historians debate whether he acted alone or whether the Nazis, who had everything to gain from the fire, were somehow involved. What is not debated is how Hitler used the fire. He rushed to President Hindenburg and convinced him to sign an emergency decree. The decree for the protection of the people and the state suspended all civil liberties. Freedom of speech, freedom of the press, the right to assemble, all were gone. The police could now arrest anyone they suspected of being an enemy of the state and hold them indefinitely without trial. With the communists blamed for the fire and their leaders arrested or in hiding, Hitler called for new elections. Even in an atmosphere of intimidation and violence, the Nazis did not win an outright majority. But they came close enough. On March the 23rd, Hitler brought the Enabling Act before the newly elected Reichstag. This law would give his cabinet the power to make laws without the approval of Parliament, essentially granting him dictatorial powers. To pass, it required a two-thirds majority. The only hope for democracy rested with the centre parties. Hitler offered them guarantees, promises that he would not abuse the power, that the act was temporary. Then he surrounded the building with rows of brown-shirted stormtroopers. When the vote was counted, the Enabling Act had passed. The Weimar Republic had voted itself out of existence. What followed was a process that the Nazis called Gleichschaltung, a word that means coordination or synchronization. Every aspect of German life was brought under Nazi control. State governments were dissolved and replaced by governors answerable to Berlin. Trade unions were banned, their leaders arrested, their offices occupied. Political parties were ordered to dissolve, and by July of 1933, the Nazi Party was the only legal party in Germany. Those who opposed the new order faced a brutal choice: silence, exile, or the concentration camps that were already beginning to dot the countryside at places like Dachau. By the time President Hindenburg died in August of 1934, the transformation was complete. Hitler merged the offices of President and Chancellor, declaring himself Führer, the leader of the German people. The army, which might have posed a threat, swore a personal oath of loyalty not to the Constitution, not to the nation, but to Adolf Hitler himself. Every soldier now served him alone. Every institution of state was now a tool of his will. The machinery of democracy had been replaced by the machinery of dictatorship. And that machinery was already being retooled for a far more ambitious project. Germany was no longer a republic. It was a nation preparing for war. 1920s to 1935. Secret rearmament, how Germany broke the rules. Even before Hitler came to power, Germany had been quietly preparing to break the military restrictions of the Versailles Treaty. The treaty had limited the German army to 100,000 men, a force so small it could barely function as a police force, let alone a fighting army. But the generals of the Weimar Republic were not content to accept this fate. They began planning for the day when Germany would rearm, and they found creative ways to keep their military knowledge alive. While the world watched for overt violations, the Germans were building the foundations of a future war machine in secret, in foreign lands, and inside the very offices where they were supposed to be administering a disarmed nation. The most audacious of these secret programs took place thousands of miles from German soil. In 1922, Germany signed the Treaty of Versailles with the Soviet Union. Both nations were pariahs, Germany defeated and disarmed, Russia isolated by the Bolshevik Revolution. They found common cause in their isolation. Under a series of secret agreements, Germany was allowed to establish military training facilities on Soviet territory in exchange for technical assistance and military expertise. At Lipetsk, German pilots trained in secret, learning to fly the advanced aircraft that Versailles had banned. At Kazan, German tank crews practiced maneuvers with vehicles they could not build at home. At Saratov, German chemical weapons experts worked with poison gas, another weapon forbidden by treaty. These secret arrangements kept the German military elite alive and prepared. When Hitler came to power, he inherited not just a nation, but a cadre of officers who had spent a decade thinking about how to rebuild. What changed under Hitler was the speed and the openness of the rearmament. The secrecy did not disappear overnight, but the scale of the operation expanded exponentially. Factories that had been producing civilian goods were quietly converted to military production. Contracts were awarded to companies like Krupp and Rheinmetall to develop weapon systems that existed only on paper. The German people, many of them unemployed and desperate, suddenly found work in industries that were forbidden to exist. Then came the moment of public defiance. In March of 1935, Hitler made an announcement that sent shockwaves through the capitals of Europe. Germany would reintroduce conscription. The peacetime army would be expanded to 500,000 men, 5 times the limit set at Versailles. At the same time, he revealed the existence of the Luftwaffe, a German air force that the treaty had explicitly forbidden. There was no more secrecy. Germany was openly tearing up the Treaty of Versailles, piece by piece, and daring the world to stop them. The response from Britain and France was muted. They issued protests, they expressed concern, but they did nothing. France, which had the largest army in Europe, was paralyzed by political divisions and a defensive mentality. Britain, still haunted by the memory of the trenches, was sympathetic to German demands for equality. The French and British governments signed the Anglo-German Naval Agreement later that same year, effectively endorsing German rearmament by allowing Germany to build a navy up to 35% of the size of the Royal Navy. The lesson was not lost on Hitler. The Western powers would talk, but they would not fight. Every violation that went unpunished was another green light for the next one. 1933 to 1936. How the Nazis wired the economy for war. While the world watched German rearmament with growing concern, a quiet revolution was taking place inside the German economy. The Nazis understood something that their predecessors had not. Modern war was not just about soldiers and weapons, it was about steel, coal, oil, and food. A nation that depended on imports for its survival could be strangled by a naval blockade, just as Germany had been in the First World War. If Germany was going to fight and win a war for living space, it had to be self-sufficient. It had to be able to feed its people and fuel its machines even when the enemy closed the borders. This was the logic behind the economic transformation that began almost as soon as Hitler took power. The man initially tasked with making this vision a reality was Hjalmar Schacht, a brilliant financier who had single-handedly stopped the hyperinflation of the 1920s. Schacht was not a Nazi, not really. He was a nationalist who wanted to see Germany strong again. And he understood that rearmament on the scale Hitler envisioned would cost money that Germany simply did not have. So Schacht got creative. He invented a system of financial engineering that allowed the government to borrow massive sums without revealing the true scale of the debt. Special bills, known as MIFO bills, were issued to arms manufacturers who could then use them as payment or trade them to other companies. The central bank guaranteed them, but they did not appear in the regular budget. It was a shell game, but it worked. By 1936, Germany was spending billions on rearmament, and the unemployment rate had plummeted from 6 million to barely 1 million. But Schacht was a traditionalist at heart. He believed in balanced budgets and sustainable growth. Hitler and the radical wing of the Nazi Party had no such concerns. They believed that the economy existed to serve the state, and the state existed to prepare for war. In 1936, Hitler unveiled the 4-year plan, a massive economic program that would shift Germany onto a permanent war footing. He placed the plan under the control of Hermann Göring, the flamboyant Air Force chief who had no qualms about using any means necessary to achieve his goals. The 4-year plan had one overriding objective: to make Germany ready for war within 4 years. The plan was based on the slogan, "Guns before butter." The German people would have to make sacrifices. Consumer goods, nice-to-have items, would take a back seat to the production of tanks, planes, and artillery. Raw materials like rubber and oil, which Germany lacked, would be replaced by synthetic substitutes produced in German factories at enormous cost. The goal was autarky, complete economic self-sufficiency. Göring had the power to dictate what factories produced, what raw materials they received, and what prices they paid. It was a command economy, directed from the top, with one purpose only. The results were impressive on the surface. German industry hummed with activity. New highways called autobahns were built, partly to provide work and partly to allow for the rapid movement of troops. The chemical giant IG Farben built factories to produce synthetic rubber and synthetic fuel. The army grew by the month, and the Air Force, the Luftwaffe, became the most advanced in the world. But there was a hidden cost. The German economy was becoming a house of cards. It depended on continued expansion. The raw materials had to come from somewhere, and if they could not be bought, they would have to be taken. The 4-year plan did not just prepare Germany for war, it made war inevitable. Because if Germany stopped expanding, the entire economic edifice would collapse. By 1939, the choice was stark: conquer or crumble. 1936, the Rhineland Gamble. By early 1936, Hitler had rearmed Germany in secret, then in public, and the world had done nothing. He had reintroduced conscription, built an air force, and expanded the army, and the world had merely protested. But there was one final restriction of the Versailles Treaty that still stood, a restriction that was not just a matter of numbers, but of geography. The Rhineland, a strip of German territory along the border with France and Belgium, was permanently demilitarized. No German troops were allowed there. No fortifications could be built. It was a buffer zone designed to give France security against any future German aggression. And on March 7, 1936, Hitler decided to tear up that part of the treaty as well. The decision was a colossal gamble. The German army that marched into the Rhineland was not the mighty force that would later conquer Europe. It was a shadow of what it would become. The troops sent across the Rhine numbered only about 3,000 men, a symbolic force. The orders they carried were explicit. If they encountered resistance from the French army, they were to withdraw immediately. The German High Command was terrified. Most of the generals believed that France would respond with force, and they knew that Germany was in no position to fight a war. If France marched, Germany would have to retreat in humiliation, and Hitler would likely be finished. But the French did not march. Despite having the largest and best-equipped army in Europe, capable of sweeping the tiny German force back across the Rhine in a matter of hours, the French government hesitated. France was in the middle of an election campaign, and the politicians were unwilling to take decisive action. The army, which had been built for defense, was reluctant to move without political authorization. The French High Command asked the government for permission to mobilize, and the government refused. Instead, France protested to the League of Nations and waited for someone else to act. Britain, for its part, was sympathetic to Germany. Many in the British establishment believed that the Treaty of Versailles had been too harsh, and that Germany was simply reclaiming its own backyard. The British press largely supported the German move. The government issued statements of concern, but made it clear that it would not go to war over the Rhineland. The French, seeing that they would stand alone, did nothing. The German troops marched into Cologne, into Mainz, into Trier, and the people cheered. They threw flowers at the soldiers. It felt like a liberation, not an occupation. For Hitler, the Rhineland Gamble was a turning point. He had trusted his instincts, ignored the warnings of his generals, and been proven right. The Western powers, he concluded, were weak. They would talk, they would protest, but they would not fight. This lesson would shape every decision he made in the years that followed. The demilitarized zone was now fortified, and German troops stood on the border of France. The strategic balance had shifted. France could no longer threaten Germany from the west without a major offensive. And Hitler, emboldened by success, began to look east. The path to Austria and Czechoslovakia was now open. The window for action was still open, but Hitler knew it would not stay that way forever. 1937. The Hossbach Memorandum. On the afternoon of November 5, 1937, Adolf Hitler summoned his top military commanders to a meeting in the Reich Chancellery in Berlin. Present were the War Minister, the Foreign Minister, and the commanders of the Army, Navy, and Air Force. Also in the room was Hitler's military adjutant, Colonel Friedrich Hossbach, who would later write down what he heard. The meeting lasted for hours, and what Hitler told his generals was so explosive, so revealing of his true intentions, that the document recording it would later become one of the most important pieces of evidence at the Nuremberg trials. It was the moment when Hitler took off the mask and showed his inner circle exactly what he planned to do. Hitler began by stating that what he was about to say should be regarded as his political testament, to be remembered in case of his death. He then laid out a vision of German foreign policy that left no room for doubt. Germany's future, he argued, depended entirely on solving its need for living space, the Lebensraum he had written about in Mein Kampf. This space could only be found in Europe, and it could only be acquired by force. There was no other way. The question was not whether Germany would expand, but when. And the answer to that question was now, because time was not on Germany's side. He then laid out a timeline that shocked some of the generals in the room. Germany's advantage in rearmament, he explained, would peak in the years 1943 to 1945. After that, the other powers would have caught up. The window of opportunity was closing. Therefore, he intended to act before then, possibly as early as 1938. The first targets, he made clear, would be Austria and Czechoslovakia. These were not just German-speaking lands, they were strategic necessities. Their resources and their territory would strengthen Germany for the larger war to come, the war against the West, and ultimately the war against the Soviet Union. The reaction from the generals was mixed. Some, like Hermann Göring, were enthusiastic. Others were deeply alarmed. The War Minister, Field Marshal Werner von Blomberg, and the Army Commander, General Werner von Fritsch, objected. They argued that Germany was not ready for a major war. They warned that France and Britain would not stand by while Germany crushed Czechoslovakia. They insisted that any such move would trigger a general European war that Germany would lose. Hitler dismissed their concerns. He was convinced that the Western powers would not fight. The meeting ended with tension in the air, and within months, both Blomberg and Fritsch would be forced out of their positions, replaced by men more willing to follow Hitler's lead. The Hossbach Memorandum reveals something crucial about the origins of World War II. It shows that the decision for war was made years in advance, not in a moment of crisis. It shows that Hitler saw time as an enemy, not an ally, and it shows that he was willing to override the cautious advice of his own military experts in pursuit of his ideological goals. The conference was not about whether to expand, but when. And the when was soon. The window was shrinking, and Hitler was determined to slip through it before it closed for good. 1937 to 1938. Bloodless Victories, the path of least resistance. After the Hossbach Conference, the question facing Hitler was not whether to move, but how. He had told his generals that force would be necessary, but he also understood the value of deception. If he could achieve his goals without firing a shot, if he could intimidate his opponents into submission, he would gain everything he wanted while the world stood by and watched. This was the strategy of the bluff, the path of least resistance. It had worked in the Rhineland, and Hitler was convinced it would work again. The key was to identify the weakness of his enemies and exploit it mercilessly. The strategy depended on a careful reading of the international mood. Britain and France had been traumatized by the First World War. Their leaders, their generals, and their people were terrified of another bloodbath. This fear was the weapon Hitler intended to use. He would make demands, escalate them, threaten war, and then watch as the Western powers scrambled to find a compromise. As long as he moved against targets that the British and French could convince themselves were reasonable, as long as he cloaked his aggression in the language of national self-determination, he believed they would give way. This approach also required a careful manipulation of public opinion. The Nazis were masters of propaganda, and they understood that a war fought for living space in the East would not be popular in the West. So they framed their demands in terms that the British and French could accept. They spoke of the right of German people to self-determination, the same principle that had been invoked at Versailles to create new nations in Eastern Europe. They pointed to the mistreatment of German minorities in neighboring countries. They made themselves appear as the victims, not the aggressors. And all the while, they built up the threat of war, the terrifying prospect of another European conflagration, to pressure the democracies into concessions. The success of this strategy depended on one crucial factor: the willingness of the target to resist. Hitler studied his opponents carefully. He knew that Austria was isolated and weak. He knew that Czechoslovakia's alliance with France was only as strong as France's will to fight. And he knew that the Soviet Union, which had treaties with both France and Czechoslovakia, was viewed with suspicion and distrust by the Western powers. Each target was a test. Each bloodless victory would weaken the next target's will to resist and embolden Hitler to push further. The path of least resistance led directly to the heart of Europe, and Hitler was already walking it. By early 1938, the stage was set. The first target was Austria, the land of Hitler's birth. For years, Austrian Nazis had been agitating for union with Germany, but the Austrian government had resisted. Now, with Germany rearmed and the Western powers passive, the moment had come to bring Austria home. The strategy of bluff was about to be tested again, and this time the stakes were even higher. 1938, the Anschluss welcoming Austria into the Reich. In February of 1938, the Austrian Chancellor Kurt Schuschnigg received an invitation that he knew he could not refuse. He was summoned to meet Hitler at the Führer's mountain retreat in Berchtesgaden, high in the Bavarian Alps. Schuschnigg was a conservative patriot who had tried to keep his country independent, but he was walking into a trap. For hours, Hitler berated him, threatened him, and demanded that he lift the ban on the Austrian Nazi Party and appoint its leaders to key government positions. Schuschnigg, isolated and alone, eventually gave in. He signed an agreement that effectively handed control of Austria to the Nazis, but when he returned to Vienna, he had second thoughts. He decided to fight back with the only weapon he had left, the Austrian people. Schuschnigg announced that he would hold a plebiscite, a public vote, on the question of Austrian independence. The vote would ask the Austrian people whether they wanted a free and independent Austria or union with Germany. It was a desperate gamble, and Schuschnigg hoped that the Austrian people, many of whom were not Nazis, would vote to keep their country. But Hitler was not about to let that happen. When he heard about the planned vote, he flew into a rage. He demanded that the plebiscite be cancelled immediately, and to back up his demand, he ordered the German army to prepare for invasion. On March 11th, the pressure reached its breaking point. German troops massed on the border. Goering, on the phone from Berlin, delivered an ultimatum to the Austrian president: cancel the vote and resign, or face invasion. The Austrian president, Wilhelm Miklas, initially refused, but as the hours ticked by and no help arrived from Britain or France, his resistance crumbled. Schuschnigg resigned, and the Austrian Nazi leader Arthur Seyss-Inquart was appointed chancellor. His first act was to invite the German army to come in and restore order. It was a fiction, of course. The invitation had been written in Berlin and transmitted to Vienna, but it gave the invasion the thin veneer of legality. On March 12th, German troops crossed the border and marched into Austria. They were met not by resistance, but by cheering crowds. Many Austrians genuinely welcomed the Union, the Anschluss. They waved swastika flags, threw flowers, and greeted Hitler as a hero when he crossed into his homeland the next day. In Vienna, the largest crowds in the city's history turned out to see him. The Anschluss was ratified by a subsequent plebiscite, held under the watchful eyes of Nazi officials, which reported over 99% approval. Austria had ceased to exist. It was now the Ostmark, a province of Greater Germany. The world's reaction was muted. Britain protested but did nothing. France was in the midst of another political crisis and had no government to respond. Italy, which had once guaranteed Austrian independence, had been brought into Hitler's orbit and offered no objection. The Anschluss was another bloodless victory, another test passed, and it changed the strategic map of Europe. Germany now surrounded Czechoslovakia on three sides. The next target was already in sight, and the bluff was working better than anyone could have imagined. 1938. The Sudeten Crisis. Inventing a conflict. With Austria absorbed into the Reich, Hitler turned his attention to Czechoslovakia. This was not just another German-speaking territory. Czechoslovakia was a democratic state, a functioning republic, and a key French ally. It had a modern army and formidable fortifications along its border with Germany. But it also had a vulnerability, a weakness that Hitler intended to exploit. 3 million ethnic Germans lived in a border region called the Sudetenland. They had never been part of Germany, not really, but they were German speakers, and their presence gave Hitler the excuse he needed to meddle in Czechoslovakia's affairs. The man Hitler chose to lead this campaign was Konrad Henlein, the leader of the Sudeten German Party. Henlein was given a simple instruction, an instruction that reveals the cynical nature of the entire crisis. He was told to make demands that the Czechoslovak government could not possibly accept. He was to demand so much that we can never be satisfied, as Hitler put it. The goal was not to win concessions for the Sudeten Germans. The goal was to create chaos, to provoke a crisis, to give Germany a reason to intervene. Throughout the spring and summer of 1938, Henlein did exactly that. He made increasingly outrageous demands. He demanded full autonomy for the Sudetenland. He demanded the right to fly the swastika. He demanded that Czechoslovak troops be withdrawn from the region. Each time the Czechoslovak government, desperate to avoid war, made concessions. And each time, Henlein raised the bar. The British government, watching from a distance, grew increasingly alarmed. They sent a mediator, Lord Runciman, to try to find a solution. But Runciman's mission was doomed from the start, because the Sudeten German Party was not negotiating in good faith. They were following orders from Berlin, and Berlin did not want a settlement. By September, the situation had reached the boiling point. Hitler gave a speech at the Nazi Party rally in Nuremberg, in which he denounced the Czechoslovak government and demanded justice for the Sudeten Germans. He threatened war. The Czechoslovak army mobilized. France mobilized its reserves. Europe held its breath. The world watched as the continent that had torn itself apart 20 years before seemed poised to do it again. And in London, the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain made a decision that would define his legacy. He would not let Europe go to war over a quarrel in a faraway country. He would go to Germany himself and talk to Hitler face to face. The countdown to Munich had begun. 1938. Countdown to catastrophe. The world holds its breath. As the summer of 1938 drew to a close, the people of Europe went about their daily lives with a growing sense of unease. The newspapers were filled with alarming headlines about the crisis in Czechoslovakia, about German troops massing on the border, about the impossible demands coming from Berlin. In London, workers began digging trenches in the parks, preparing for the air raids that everyone knew would come if war broke out. Gas masks were distributed to millions of civilians. Hospitals made plans to evacuate patients. The city of Paris began moving art treasures from the Louvre to locations in the countryside. Europe was holding its breath, waiting to see whether the continent would once again descend into the horror of industrial warfare. At the center of the storm was the British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain. Chamberlain was a businessman by training, a practical man who believed that problems could be solved through negotiation and compromise. He had never wanted to be a war leader. He had come to office hoping to continue the work of peace and prosperity. Now, at the age of 69, he found himself facing the greatest crisis of his life. On September 13th, with the situation growing more dangerous by the hour, Chamberlain made a dramatic decision. He would fly to Germany to meet Hitler face to face. It was an unprecedented move. No British Prime Minister had ever made such a journey in a time of crisis. But Chamberlain believed that personal diplomacy could bridge the gap and prevent the catastrophe that loomed. On September 15th, Chamberlain stepped off a plane in Munich and traveled by train to Hitler's mountain retreat at Berchtesgaden. The two men met in a room with a spectacular view of the Alps, and Hitler laid out his demands. He wanted the Sudetenland. He wanted it now. He claimed that he was willing to risk a world war to get it. Chamberlain listened, asked questions, and eventually extracted a promise from Hitler that he would not act immediately, that he would give the British time to consult with the French and the Czechoslovaks. Chamberlain returned to London convinced that he had bought precious time, but the price of that time was becoming clear. The only way to avoid war was to pressure Czechoslovakia into surrendering its border regions. The French, who were bound by treaty to defend Czechoslovakia, were equally desperate to avoid war. They joined the British in pressuring the Czechoslovak government to accept a plan that would transfer all areas with more than 50% German population to Germany. The Czechoslovak president, Edvard Beneš, initially resisted. He knew that giving up the Sudetenland would strip his country of its mountain defenses and leave it helpless. But as the days passed and no help arrived from the West, his resistance crumbled. On September 21st, the Czechoslovak government accepted the Anglo-French plan. They had been betrayed by their allies, but at least there would be peace. Then came the second shock. When Chamberlain returned to Germany on September 22nd, this time to the town of Bad Godesberg on the Rhine, he expected to finalize the agreement. Instead, Hitler raised the stakes. The Sudetenland was no longer enough. Now, he demanded immediate military occupation of the territory by German troops, and he set a deadline of October 1st. The British delegation was stunned. Chamberlain protested that this was not what they had agreed upon. But Hitler was unmoved. The bluff had become a demand, and the demand came with a countdown clock. The world was now days away from war. September 1938. The Munich Agreement, peace for our time. As the deadline of October 1st approached, Europe stood on the knife's edge of war. The British fleet mobilized. Trenches were dug in London's parks. In Berlin, people watched the preparations with a mixture of fear and resignation. The French army called up reservists. In Czechoslovakia, millions of people prepared for an invasion they knew they could not survive alone. And then, at the last possible moment, a miracle seemed to happen. Mussolini, at Hitler's request, proposed a conference of the great powers. The leaders of Germany, Italy, France, and Britain would meet in Munich to find a final solution to the crisis. Czechoslovakia, the country whose fate was being decided, was not invited. The Munich conference opened on September 29, 1938. The participants were Hitler, Mussolini, the French Prime Minister Édouard Daladier, and Neville Chamberlain. They met in the Führerbau, Hitler's official building in Munich, and the discussions lasted well into the night. There was never any real negotiation. The terms had already been decided. The Sudetenland would be ceded to Germany. The Czechoslovak army would begin evacuating the territory on October 1st, the very day Hitler had originally set for his invasion. The Czechs would be given no choice but to accept. The agreement was signed in the early hours of September 30th. The next morning, Chamberlain went to Hitler's apartment to discuss the future. He produced a brief statement that he hoped the two leaders could sign, a declaration of Anglo-German friendship and a commitment to resolve all future disputes through consultation. Hitler glanced at it, read it quickly, and signed without enthusiasm. For Chamberlain, this piece of paper was the real prize. It was proof that Hitler could be trusted, that the policy of appeasement had worked, that peace could be preserved. When Chamberlain returned to London that afternoon, he stepped off the plane at Heston Aerodrome and waved the declaration to the waiting crowd. He spoke the words that would forever define his legacy. He said, "This is the second time in our history that there has come back from Germany to Downing Street peace with honor. I believe it is peace for our time." The reaction in Britain and France was euphoric. People wept with relief. They cheered Chamberlain in the streets. They believed that war had been averted, that the nightmare was over. But not everyone was fooled. Winston Churchill, then a backbench member of Parliament, rose in the House of Commons to deliver a grim warning. He told his colleagues that Britain and France had suffered a total, unmitigated defeat. He said that they had been faced with a choice between war and dishonor. They chose dishonor. They would have war all the same. The Czechoslovak government, forced to accept the betrayal of its allies, watched in despair as German troops marched into the Sudetenland. The fortifications that had cost millions to build, the mountain defenses that could have held off a German attack for months, all were surrendered without a shot. For Hitler, the Munich Agreement was a disappointment disguised as a victory. He had wanted war. He had wanted to crush Czechoslovakia and demonstrate German military might. The Western powers had robbed him of that opportunity by giving him everything he demanded without a fight. He told his inner circle that Chamberlain had spoiled his entry into Prague, but the agreement also confirmed everything Hitler believed about his opponents. They were weak. They were cowardly. They would always give way if he pushed hard enough. The lesson of Munich was not that appeasement worked. The lesson of Munich was that the democracies would not fight. And that lesson would have deadly consequences in the months to come. March 1939. Why Hitler broke his promise. The ink was barely dry on the Munich Agreement when Hitler began planning its destruction. He had promised that the Sudetenland was his last territorial demand in Europe. He had signed a declaration of friendship with Chamberlain. He had assured the world that he wanted nothing more than to live in peace. But inside the Reich Chancellery, the plans were already being drawn up for the next move. The rump state of Czechoslovakia, stripped of its border fortifications and its industrial resources, was now helpless. It was a dagger pointed at the heart of Germany, Hitler told his generals, and it had to be removed. Throughout the winter of 1938 to 1939, Hitler encouraged separatist movements inside the remaining Czech lands. Slovakia, the eastern part of the country, was pushed to declare independence. The Czech president, Emil Hácha, a frail old man who had succeeded Beneš after Munich, watched in despair as his country fell apart. On March 14th, Slovakia formally declared independence under the protection of Germany. The next day, Hácha was summoned to Berlin. He arrived at the Reich Chancellery late in the evening and was led into Hitler's presence. For hours, Hitler and Goering subjected him to relentless pressure. They told him that German troops were already on the move, that if he resisted, Prague would be bombed into rubble. Hacha, who had a weak heart, collapsed during the meeting and had to be revived by Hitler's personal physician. Finally, broken and desperate, he signed a document placing the Czech people under the protection of the German Reich. It was just after 4 in the morning. Later that same day, March 15, 1939, German troops marched into Prague. Unlike the entry into the Rhineland or the annexation of Austria, this was not greeted by cheering crowds. The Czech people watched in silence as the tanks rolled through the streets of their ancient capital. Hitler himself arrived that evening and spent the night in Hradčany Castle, the former seat of the kings of Bohemia. He stood at the window looking out over the city he had just conquered and declared that Czechoslovakia had ceased to exist. In its place, the Germans established the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, a colony ruled by a Reich protector. It was the first time Hitler had taken non-German land. The promise of Munich, the promise of peace for our time, lay in ruins. The reaction in Britain and France was finally one of outrage. This was not self-determination. This was not the reunion of German-speaking peoples. This was naked aggression against a defenseless nation. Chamberlain, who had staked his reputation on the Munich Agreement, was humiliated. In a speech in Birmingham on March 17th, he asked the question that was on everyone's mind. Is this the last attack upon a small state, or is it to be followed by others? He answered his own question with a warning. He said that no greater mistake could be made than to suppose that because Germany believes she has gained all she needs, she will now stop. The policy of appeasement was dead. The question now was what would replace it. 1939. The shift in the West. The German occupation of Prague marked a turning point in the psychology of the Western democracies. For years, they had convinced themselves that Hitler's demands were reasonable, that he was simply correcting the injustices of Versailles, that he could be satisfied with a few concessions. Prague shattered that illusion. Hitler had taken land that was not German. He had destroyed a state that had done nothing to threaten him. He had revealed that his appetite was not just for German-speaking territories, but for domination of the entire continent. The British and French governments finally understood that they were dealing with a predator and that no amount of concessions would ever be enough. The first concrete sign of the new policy came within weeks. On March 31, 1939, Chamberlain announced in the House of Commons that Britain had issued a guarantee to Poland. If Poland was attacked, and if the Polish government resisted, Britain would come to its aid. It was a revolutionary commitment. Britain had traditionally avoided alliances in Eastern Europe. Now it was pledging to go to war for a country that was not a democracy, a country that was hundreds of miles from its borders. The guarantee was extended to Romania and Greece as well, creating a network of commitments designed to deter further German aggression. France, bound by its existing alliance with Poland, confirmed that it would stand with Britain. But there was a fundamental problem with the guarantee. How could Britain and France actually help Poland? The only way to reach Poland was through Germany. The British and French armies were in the west, separated from their new ally by the entire breadth of German territory. If Germany invaded Poland, the Western allies could not send troops to defend it. They could only declare war and hope that the threat of a two-front conflict would deter Hitler. It was a bluff, and Hitler knew it. He told his generals that the Western powers would talk, they would protest, but they would not fight. They had proved that at Munich. They would prove it again. Throughout the spring and summer of 1939, the diplomatic dance continued. Hitler denounced the Polish guarantee as aggression against Germany. He demanded the return of the free city of Danzig, which was predominantly German, but governed by the League of Nations. He demanded a road and railway across the Polish corridor to connect Germany with East Prussia. The Poles, emboldened by the British guarantee, refused. They knew that conceding to these demands would only lead to more demands, just as it had with Czechoslovakia. The atmosphere grew increasingly tense. In Britain, conscription was introduced for the first time in peacetime. In Germany, the newspapers screamed about Polish atrocities against the German minority. The world watched and waited, knowing that the next crisis would not end with a conference in Munich. The next crisis would end with war. The question that haunted the capitals of Europe was whether Stalin would join the Western Allies or make his own deal with Hitler. The Soviet Union had been excluded from Munich, treated as an untouchable pariah by the Western powers. Now, with war approaching, both sides courted the Soviets. British and French delegations traveled to Moscow for negotiations, but they moved slowly, suspiciously, without real authority to offer what Stalin wanted most: control over the Baltic states and a free hand in eastern Poland. Stalin watched and waited, calculating his options. He knew that Hitler needed him more than the Western Allies did. And he knew that the man who had written Mein Kampf, the man who had sworn to destroy communism and conquer Russian land, was about to make him an offer he could not refuse. Spring, 1939. Danzig or war. The propaganda machine targets Poland. With the guarantee to Poland in place, Hitler faced a new challenge. He could no longer simply threaten Czechoslovakia into submission. The Poles, unlike the Czechs, had shown that they would fight. The British and French, unlike the year before, had shown that they would support them. If Hitler was going to take Danzig and the Polish corridor, he would have to be prepared for a general European war. But he did not believe it would come to that. He told his generals that the Western powers would bluff, but they would not fight. They would declare war on paper, he said, and then they would do nothing while Germany crushed Poland in a matter of weeks. The propaganda machine, which had served so well in the Sudeten Crisis, was now turned on Poland. The Nazi press and radio outlets flooded Germany with stories of Polish atrocities against the German minority living in the territories that had once been part of the Reich. These stories were exaggerated when they were not completely invented. They told of Germans being beaten in the streets, of their homes being burned, of their women being assaulted. The purpose was not just to justify aggression to the outside world, but to prepare the German people for war, to make them believe that Germany was the victim, not the aggressor, and that the coming conflict was a defensive necessity. The focal point of the crisis was the free city of Danzig. Danzig was not part of Poland, but it was not part of Germany either. It was an international city administered by the League of Nations, with special rights for Poland, including control of the customs and access to the sea. The population was overwhelmingly German, and they had voted for Nazi representatives in local elections. Throughout the summer of 1939, the Nazi leadership in Danzig, under the control of Albert Forster, escalated tensions. They demanded that the city be returned to the Reich. They organized demonstrations. They smuggled weapons into the city. The Polish government, watching these developments with alarm, refused to budge. They knew that losing Danzig would mean losing access to the Baltic Sea, turning Poland into a landlocked nation dependent on German goodwill. Hitler addressed the Reichstag on April 28, 1939, in a speech that lasted more than 2 hours. He denounced the Polish guarantee as proof of British encirclement policy. He renounced the German-Polish non-aggression pact that had been signed 5 years earlier, and he demanded the return of Danzig and the corridor, but he also offered Poland something in return, a guarantee of its new borders and a share in the economic benefits of a German-controlled Eastern Europe. It was the same tactic he had used with Czechoslovakia. Combine the threat of force with the promise of cooperation and hope that the target would crack. But the Poles did not crack. They mobilized their army and waited for the storm to break. By the summer of 1939, the situation was a diplomatic stalemate. Germany demanded Danzig. Poland refused. Britain and France repeated their guarantee. Hitler became convinced that the only way to break the deadlock was to prove that the Western powers were bluffing. He would attack Poland, and when the British and French failed to act, the whole edifice of the guarantee would collapse. But first, he had to make sure that when he attacked Poland, he would not have to fight the Soviet Union at the same time. The impossible alliance, the deal with the devil, was about to become a reality. May 1939. The Pact of Steel. Hitler ties himself to Mussolini. While the crisis with Poland dominated the headlines, Hitler was also working to solidify his alliances. The most important of these was with Italy, the other major fascist power in Europe. Benito Mussolini Il Duce had been in power since 1922, longer than Hitler himself. He was the senior partner in the fascist movement, the man Hitler had once admired and sought to emulate. But Mussolini was also cautious. He knew that Italy was not prepared for a major war. The Italian military was poorly equipped, the economy was weak, and the Italian people had no enthusiasm for another conflict. Mussolini had stayed out of the crisis over Czechoslovakia the year before, watching from the sidelines while Hitler took all the risks. But Hitler needed Italy. He needed a partner in the south to distract the French, to threaten British communications in the Mediterranean, to make the Western powers think twice about intervening in the east. Throughout the spring of 1939, German diplomats pressed the Italians for a formal military alliance. Mussolini, ever the opportunist, eventually agreed. He believed that Hitler was winning, and he wanted to be on the winning side. He also believed, wrongly, that war would not come for several years, giving Italy time to prepare. On May 22, 1939, the foreign ministers of Germany and Italy met in Berlin to sign the Pact of Steel. The Pact of Steel was more than a simple alliance. It was a commitment that went far beyond the usual promises of consultation and mutual support. It bound each signatory to come to the aid of the other immediately and with all its military forces if either became involved in a war, regardless of who was the aggressor. It was an offensive alliance designed to support German expansion in the east and Italian expansion in the Mediterranean. When the Italian Foreign Minister Galeazzo Ciano read the final text, he was alarmed. He had expected something more limited. He had expected escape clauses that would allow Italy to stay out if the war came too soon. But Hitler had insisted on the strongest possible language, and Mussolini, not wanting to appear weak, had agreed. The problem was that Italy was not ready. When the German military attaché in Rome reported on Italy's preparedness, the picture was grim. The Italian army was short of tanks, artillery, and motor transport. The Italian Air Force had modern planes on paper, but few in service. The Italian Navy was powerful, but vulnerable to British bases in the Mediterranean. Most importantly, Italy was desperately short of raw materials. It depended on imports for coal, oil, and steel. If war came, Italy could not fight for more than a few months without German support. When Hitler informed Mussolini in August that he intended to attack Poland immediately, Mussolini panicked. He sent a letter to Hitler explaining that Italy was not ready and could not participate. The Pact of Steel, signed with such fanfare just 3 months earlier, was useless. Hitler would have to fight alone or find another partner. Summer 1939. The Impossible Alliance. Hitler's offer to Stalin. As the summer of 1939 wore on, the diplomatic landscape shifted in ways that few could have predicted. The man who had built his career on hatred of communism, the man who had written in Mein Kampf that the German people must conquer living space from the Soviet Union, was now contemplating an alliance with Joseph Stalin. It was the ultimate betrayal of everything the Nazi Party claimed to believe. But Hitler was a pragmatist when it came to power. He wanted to destroy the Soviet Union eventually, but first he had to neutralize it. He had to ensure that when he invaded Poland, Stalin would not stab him in the back. The Soviets, for their part, had their own reasons for listening. Stalin had watched the Munich Agreement with alarm. He had seen the Western powers sell out Czechoslovakia, a democratic state and a French ally. He drew the obvious conclusion: Britain and France could not be trusted. They were hoping, Stalin believed, to turn Hitler eastward, to encourage German expansion against the Soviet Union while they sat safely behind their defenses. If that was the game, Stalin was determined to play it better. He would make his own deal with Hitler, buy time to prepare the Soviet military, and let the capitalist powers tear each other apart. Throughout the summer, the Germans and Soviets probed each other's intentions. Trade negotiations, which had been ongoing for months, provided a cover for political discussions. In early August, the German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop signaled that Germany was ready for a fundamental reorientation of relations. Stalin got the message. He dismissed his long-serving foreign minister, Maxim Litvinov, who was Jewish and closely identified with collective security against Germany, and replaced him with Vyacheslav Molotov, a tough negotiator who would do Stalin's bidding. The signal was clear. The Soviets were ready to deal. On August 14th, Ribbentrop sent a dramatic telegram to Moscow. He proposed that he come to the Soviet capital immediately to sign a non-aggression pact. The Soviets responded cautiously at first, asking questions, testing German intentions. But as the days passed and the Polish crisis reached its climax, the negotiations accelerated. On August 19th, Germany and the Soviet Union signed a trade agreement. More importantly, Stalin agreed to receive Ribbentrop in Moscow within the week. The stage was set for the most shocking diplomatic coup of the entire interwar period. August 23rd, 1939. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. On the afternoon of August 23rd, 1939, a German plane landed at Moscow's airport carrying Joachim von Ribbentrop. He was met by Soviet officials and driven to the Kremlin, where he was ushered into the presence of Joseph Stalin himself. The meeting lasted late into the night. Stalin, who rarely involved himself directly in diplomatic negotiations, was there in person, chain-smoking his way through the discussions. He and Ribbentrop got along surprisingly well. They shared a common enemy in the Western democracies, and they shared a common interest in dividing up Eastern Europe. By the time the meeting ended, they had agreed on the text of a treaty that would change the course of history. The public part of the agreement was a non-aggression pact. Germany and the Soviet Union pledged not to attack each other, not to support any third power that attacked the other, and to resolve all disputes through consultation. It was a standard diplomatic document, the kind of thing that nations sign all the time. But attached to it was a secret protocol, a document that the world would not learn about until after the war, when German copies were discovered and presented at Nuremberg. That secret protocol divided Eastern Europe into German and Soviet spheres of influence. The line ran roughly along the rivers Narew, Vistula, and San. Territories to the west of the line, including most of Poland, would be the German sphere. Territories to the east, including eastern Poland, Finland, Estonia, and Latvia, would be the Soviet sphere. Lithuania was initially assigned to Germany, but in a later adjustment, it would be traded to the Soviet Union in exchange for more Polish territory. The agreement gave Hitler exactly what he needed: assurance that the Soviet Union would not interfere when he invaded Poland. It gave Stalin what he wanted: a buffer zone of territory that would protect the Soviet Union from future German aggression and time to prepare for the war he knew would eventually come. The news of the pact exploded across the world. In London and Paris, there was shock and disbelief. The ideological enemies had become partners. The anti-Comintern pact was dead. The Western strategy of containing Germany by building an alliance with the Soviet Union lay in ruins. In Berlin, the reaction was more muted. Many Germans were confused by the pact with their sworn enemy, but they trusted Hitler. In Moscow, Soviet propaganda celebrated the agreement as a triumph of peace, while secretly, Stalin smiled at the chaos he had sown. The last obstacle to war had been removed. Hitler could now attack Poland without fear of a two-front war. The countdown had begun. August 25th to August 31st, 1939. The final orders. Hitler's last-minute nerves. With the pact signed, Hitler moved quickly. On August 22nd, he gathered his generals at the Berghof, his mountain retreat, and told them that the time for action had come. He told them that he was convinced that Britain and France would not fight. He told them that the destruction of Poland was the goal and that they should be ruthless. He ordered the invasion to begin on August 26th. The machinery of war was set in motion. Millions of men were mobilized. Tanks rolled toward the Polish border. The Luftwaffe prepared its squadrons for the first strikes. The world was hours away from war. Then, on August 25th, two events occurred that gave Hitler pause. First, word arrived from London that Britain had formally signed the mutual assistance treaty with Poland that had been promised back in March. It was no longer just a guarantee. It was a binding alliance, ratified and signed. Second, a message came from Mussolini. The Italian dictator, realizing that war was imminent, had finally admitted the truth. Italy was not ready. It could not fight. The Pact of Steel, signed with such fanfare just 3 months earlier, was worthless. Hitler received the news in the early afternoon. He stared at the message for a long moment, then made a decision that stunned his staff. He cancelled the invasion. The orders went out frantically. Some units had already crossed the border. They had to be pulled back. The timetable, so carefully planned, was in chaos. For the next several days, Europe experienced a strange lull. Hitler hesitated, uncertain of his next move. He sent feelers to London, offering to guarantee the British Empire in exchange for a free hand in the East. He waited for a response that never came. The British, once bitten by Munich, were not about to be fooled again. They stood by their Polish ally. The diplomatic dance continued, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. Hitler had merely postponed the inevitable. On August 29th, Hitler presented an ultimatum to Poland. He demanded that a Polish plenipotentiary with full powers arrive in Berlin within 24 hours to negotiate the future of Danzig and the corridor. It was the same tactic he had used against Austria and Czechoslovakia. Demand an impossible concession, set an impossible deadline, and then blame the victim when war comes. The Poles refused to send anyone. They would not repeat the mistakes of Schuschnigg and Hacha. They would not come to Berlin to be bullied and threatened. They would fight. On August 31st, Hitler made his final decision. At 12:40 in the afternoon, he issued Führer Directive No. 1 for the conduct of the war. It ordered the German armed forces to attack Poland at 4:45 the next morning. The orders went out to the units waiting on the border. The war that had been planned for so long, the war that had been delayed at the last moment, was finally about to begin. There was one more piece of theatre to perform before the shooting started. The Nazis needed a reason, a justification, a story to tell the German people and the world. Operation Himmler was about to begin. August 31st, 1939. Operation Himmler. In the annals of cynical deception, few operations rival the sheer audacity of Operation Himmler. As the sun set on August 31st, 1939, a small group of men gathered at a radio station near the German-Polish border. The station was located in the town of Gliwice, a place where Germans and Poles had lived side by side for centuries. The men who gathered there were not soldiers in any conventional sense. They were SS operatives, men trained in the dark arts of espionage and sabotage, and they were about to stage an attack that would give Hitler the excuse he needed to invade Poland. The operation was the brainchild of Reinhard Heydrich, the head of the Reich Security Main Office, the man known as the hangman of the Nazi regime. Heydrich was a master of deception, a cold-blooded intellectual who understood that the appearance of aggression was just as important as the reality. He assembled a team under the command of Alfred Norjoks, an SS officer with a talent for dirty work. Their mission was simple: seize the Gliwice radio station, broadcast a brief anti-German message in Polish, and leave behind evidence that Polish forces had carried out the attack. But there was one more element to the plan, an element of such brutality that it reveals the true nature of the Nazi regime. To make the attack convincing, the Germans needed bodies. They needed dead Poles who could be shown to the press as proof of Polish aggression. So the SS took prisoners from the concentration camps, men who had been condemned to death. They dressed them in Polish uniforms, injected them with lethal drugs, and then shot them to add bullet holes. These unfortunate souls were left at the scene as evidence of the Polish raid. They were given no names, no identities, no dignity. They were simply props in the final act of the deception. At around 8 in the evening, Naujoks and his men stormed the Gleiwitz radio station. They fired shots into the air, took control of the building, and forced a German translator to read a brief statement in Polish announcing that the time of the German-Polish conflict had come. The broadcast lasted only a few minutes, barely long enough for anyone to hear it. Then the raiders vanished into the night, leaving behind the bodies of the murdered concentration camp prisoners. The next morning, German newspapers would scream about Polish aggression, about the attack on the Gleiwitz radio station, about the blood of Germans shed by Polish terrorists. The lie was complete. The excuse for war was ready. Similar operations were carried out that same night at other locations along the border. At each one, the pattern was the same: staged attacks, dead bodies in Polish uniforms, and frantic reports of Polish aggression. The German propaganda machine swung into action, broadcasting the news to a nation that had been prepared for this moment by months of stories about Polish atrocities. The people of Germany went to sleep on the night of August 31st, believing that their country had been attacked, that they were the victims, and that the war that would begin the next morning was a war of self-defense. The deception was perfect. The world would see through it eventually, but by then it would be too late. The tanks were already rolling toward the border. September 1st, 1939, 4:45 in the morning. The first shots. In the grey light of dawn on September 1st, 1939, a relic from another age fired the first shots of a new and terrible war. The German battleship Schleswig-Holstein, an obsolete pre-dreadnought that had been launched in 1906, was moored in the harbour of the free city of Danzig on what had been described as a courtesy visit. But its guns were not aimed in courtesy. At exactly 4:45 in the morning, the ship's main batteries opened fire on the Polish military transit depot at Westerplatte, a small peninsula guarding the entrance to the harbour. The shells crashed into the Polish positions, and the Second World War had begun. At the same moment, across hundreds of miles of border, German forces surged into Poland. The Luftwaffe, the most advanced air force in the world, filled the skies. Stuka dive bombers screamed down on Polish airfields, destroying most of the Polish Air Force on the ground before it could even take off. Heinkel bombers struck at roads, railways, and communication centers, paralyzing the Polish ability to coordinate a defense. The German army, with its panzer divisions leading the way, crossed the frontier at multiple points, driving deep into Polish territory. The Poles, brave but hopelessly outmatched, fought back with desperate courage. But they were facing a military machine unlike anything the world had ever seen. While the world focused on Westerplatte, another attack was taking place that would be largely forgotten in the histories written after the war. The German Air Force also bombed the town of Wielun, a city with no military significance, no anti-aircraft defenses, no strategic value. Wave after wave of bombers struck the city center, targeting hospitals, homes, and the historic old town. It was the first terror bombing of the war, an attack designed not to achieve a military objective, but to kill civilians and spread fear. An estimated 1,200 people died in Wielun that morning, many of them women and children. The war had begun with a war crime. Throughout the first day, the German advance continued with terrifying speed. The Polish army attempted to mount a defense along the border, but the Panzer Division simply bypassed their positions, driving deep into the rear areas and cutting supply lines. The Polish cavalry, armed with sabres and lances, found themselves charging against tanks. It was not a fair fight, but they fought anyway, knowing that they were buying time for a mobilization that would never be completed. The German plan, Fall Weiss or Case White, was working exactly as its planners had intended. The Polish army was being destroyed in the field before it could fully concentrate its forces. In Berlin, Hitler waited for the reaction from London and Paris. He had convinced himself that the Western powers would not fight, that they would protest and negotiate and eventually accept the fait accompli. But as the day wore on, the news from the West was troubling. The British government had sent a formal protest demanding that Germany withdraw its forces. The French had mobilized their army. The response was not what Hitler had expected. He stood at the window of the Reich Chancellery, staring out into the darkness, waiting for word that the crisis had passed. The word did not come. The bluff was about to be called. September 1st to September 3rd, 1939, Blitzkrieg unleashed the speed of the new war. As the sun rose on September 2nd, the full horror of modern warfare was becoming apparent across the Polish countryside. This was not the war of 1914, the war of trenches and stalemate and slow grinding attrition. This was something new, something terrifying, something the world had never seen before. The German military had given it a name: Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War. It was a doctrine based on speed, surprise, and the coordinated use of armor, aircraft, and infantry to punch through enemy lines and race toward the rear areas, surrounding entire armies and cutting them off from supply and reinforcement. At the spearhead of the German advance were the panzer divisions, concentrated formations of tanks that could smash through enemy defenses and then exploit the breach. Behind them came motorized infantry, carried in trucks and armored half-tracks, ready to hold the ground the tanks had seized. Above them, the Luftwaffe provided close air support, the Stuka dive bombers with their terrifying sirens swooping down to destroy strongpoints and spread panic among the Polish troops. It was war at a tempo that the Polish army, which still relied on horses for transport and messengers on motorcycles for communication, simply could not match. The Polish army fought with courage, but courage was not enough. At the Battle of the Bzura, the Poles launched a desperate counterattack that initially achieved some success, catching German units by surprise and pushing them back. But the German response was swift and devastating. The Luftwaffe concentrated its forces against the Polish salient, bombing the trapped Polish forces into submission while German armor closed in from all sides. After more than a week of intense fighting, the Polish counterattack was crushed. Tens of thousands of Polish soldiers were killed or captured. The last chance to reverse the course of the invasion was gone. In the east, the Soviet Union watched and waited. Stalin had signed the pact with Hitler, but he was not about to let the Germans take all of Poland. On September 17th, as the Polish army was collapsing and the government fled into exile, Soviet forces crossed the eastern border. They advanced to the line agreed upon in the secret protocol of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, meeting German forces at Brest-Litovsk and other points. The Poles, already fighting for their lives against the Germans, now found themselves trapped between two invaders. Resistance continued in isolated pockets, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. Poland was being erased from the map. The speed of the German victory stunned the world. The Polish campaign lasted just over 5 weeks. By the beginning of October, organized Polish resistance had ended. The country was divided between Germany and the Soviet Union, its government in exile, its people subjected to occupation regimes that would prove among the most brutal in history. But even as the Germans celebrated their victory, the question that had haunted Hitler since August 25th remained unanswered. What would Britain and France do? The answer was about to come, and it was not the answer Hitler had expected. September 3rd, 1939, 9 in the morning. The ultimatum, Britain's final stand. In London, the morning of September 3rd dawned grey and overcast. The British people had been waiting for days, knowing that their government was engaged in a final diplomatic struggle, hoping against hope that war could somehow be averted. But the news from Poland was unmistakable. The Germans had invaded. The bombs had fallen. The British guarantee, the promise made in March, was about to be tested. At 9 o'clock that morning, the British ambassador in Berlin, Sir Neville Henderson, delivered an ultimatum to the German government. If Germany did not give satisfactory assurances that it would withdraw its forces from Poland by 11 o'clock that morning, a state of war would exist between Britain and Germany. The German Foreign Ministry received the ultimatum with a mixture of shock and disbelief. Joachim von Ribbentrop, the foreign minister who had assured Hitler that Britain would not fight, refused to receive Henderson personally. The note was handed to an interpreter, Paul Schmidt. who was instructed to deliver it to Hitler at the Reich Chancellery. Schmidt found Hitler in his study sitting at his desk. Ribbentrop stood by the window. Schmidt translated the ultimatum, the final demand, the deadline. When he finished, there was a long silence. Hitler sat motionless, staring into space. After what seemed like an eternity, he turned to Ribbentrop and asked, "What now?" Ribbentrop had no answer. He had staked his reputation on the belief that Britain would back down. He had told Hitler again and again that the British were decadent, that they would never fight for Poland, that the guarantee was a bluff. Now the bluff had been called. The two men sat in the room, the silence broken only by the ticking of the clock. Outside, the German people went about their business, unaware that their country was about to be plunged into a war that would last nearly 6 years and end in total defeat. At 11 o'clock, the deadline passed. Britain was at war with Germany. In Paris, the scene was similar, but not identical. The French had their own alliance with Poland, and they had promised to support the British, but the French were even more reluctant than the British to fight. The memory of the First World War, the slaughter of the trenches, the destruction of a generation hung over every decision. The French government delayed as long as it could, hoping that the British would find a way out, that the Poles would somehow surrender, that war could be avoided. But in the end, there was no choice. On September 3rd, a few hours after the British declaration, France also declared war on Germany. The news spread across the world. In London, the air raid sirens sounded within minutes of Chamberlain's announcement, a false alarm that sent people scrambling for shelters. In Berlin, the streets were quiet, the people subdued. There were no cheering crowds, no flags waving, no patriotic demonstrations. The German people remembered the last war, and they did not want another. Hitler, watching from the Reich Chancellery, was reportedly surprised by the public reaction. He had expected enthusiasm, celebration, a nation united behind its leader. Instead, he got silence. The war he had chosen, the war he had planned for so long, had finally begun, and it was not the war he had expected. September 3rd, 1939, 11:15 in the morning. Declaration of war. At 11:15 on the morning of September 3rd, 1939, the British people gathered around their wireless sets to hear a broadcast from the Prime Minister. Neville Chamberlain spoke in his calm, measured voice, the voice of a man who had staked everything on peace and lost. He told the nation that he had been speaking to them from the cabinet room at 10 Downing Street. He told them that the British ambassador in Berlin had delivered a final note to the German government. He told them that no such undertaking had been received, and that consequently, this country is at war with Germany. It was a moment of profound historical significance. 21 years and 9 months after the guns fell silent on the Western Front, the great powers of Europe were once again at war. The peace that had been bought at such terrible cost, the peace that had been maintained through crises and negotiations and desperate compromises, was over. The world was about to be plunged into a conflict that would dwarf even the Great War in its scale and its horror. Chamberlain spoke of the principles for which Britain was fighting, the defense of Polish independence, the honor of British commitments, the struggle against aggression. But his voice betrayed no triumph, no excitement, only a deep and abiding sadness. In Germany, there was no public announcement, no broadcast to the nation. The German people learned of the British declaration through news bulletins and newspaper extras. The reaction was not what the Nazi leadership had hoped for. There was no wave of patriotic fervor, no rush to the colors, no sense that the nation was united behind the Führer. The memory of the last war was too fresh, too painful. Many Germans believed that Hitler had blundered, that he had misjudged the British, that he had led them into a war they could not win. For the first time since he came to power, there was visible unease, visible doubt about the direction of the regime. In France, the declaration of war was met with a similar lack of enthusiasm. The French people had spent the interwar years building the Maginot Line, an enormous system of fortifications designed to ensure that they would never again have to fight on their own soil. They had built it precisely to avoid another war. Now war had come anyway. The French army mobilized, millions of men reporting to their assigned units, but they did so with heavy hearts. They knew what they were marching toward, they remembered the last time, and they were afraid. In Poland, the news of the British and French declarations brought a brief moment of hope. The Polish government, which had fled Warsaw as the German army approached, issued statements thanking their Western allies. But the hope was illusory. There was no way for Britain or France to help Poland directly. The German army was already deep inside Polish territory. The Polish capital would fall within weeks. The declarations of war were morally significant, but militarily they changed nothing for the Poles. They would fight and die alone, while the Western armies waited behind their fortifications, and the world wondered what would happen next. September 3rd to May 10th, 1940. The Phony War. The strange silence before the storm. The war had been declared, but for the people of Western Europe, nothing seemed to happen. The German army, having crushed Poland in a matter of weeks, did not immediately turn west. The French army, having mobilized millions of men, did not launch the offensive against Germany that its Polish ally had begged for. The British army, the British Expeditionary Force, crossed the Channel and took up positions along the Franco-Belgian border, but they did not advance. The war that everyone had feared, the war that had been declared with such solemnity, seemed to have vanished into thin air. It was so strange, so unreal, that American senators began calling it the Phony War. On the Western Front, French troops manned the Maginot Line, the massive fortifications that ran along the border with Germany. Across from them, German troops manned the Siegfried Line, the west wall that protected the Rhineland. Between them lay no man's land, a strip of territory where nothing happened. Patrols were rare. Shelling was non-existent. Soldiers on both sides could see each other across the lines, and sometimes they even waved. It was a war without combat, a war without movement, a war that seemed to defy logic. The French had promised to launch an offensive within 15 days of mobilizing. The 15 days came and went. Nothing happened. The French did make one gesture. In early September, they launched the Saar offensive, a limited advance into German territory near the city of Saarbrücken. French troops moved forward against negligible opposition, advancing a few miles into Germany. But the advance was cautious, slow, and limited in scope. When the Poles begged for a real offensive, the French replied that they were not ready, that they needed more time, that the offensive would come. It never came. By early October, the French had withdrawn back to their own lines, leaving the Germans in possession of the territory they had briefly occupied. The Saar offensive was over. The Phony War continued. For the next 8 months, Europe existed in a strange twilight. The governments talked of war, but the soldiers did not fight. The navies patrolled the seas, but the great battles did not come. The air forces flew reconnaissance missions, but the bombers did not strike. In London, life went on almost as normal, with theatres open and restaurants full, interrupted only by the blackouts and the rationing that reminded people that they were at war. In Paris, the same. In Berlin, the same. It was as if the continent was holding its breath, waiting for something, but no one knew exactly what. Behind the scenes, the Germans were not idle. While the world watched the Phony War, the German High Command was planning the next move. The plans for the invasion of France, originally based on a repeat of the Schlieffen Plan of 1914, had fallen into Allied hands when a German plane crash landed in Belgium. A new plan was needed, and it came from an unlikely source. General Erich von Manstein proposed a daring stroke through the Ardennes forest, a region the French considered impassable for tanks. The plan was audacious, risky, and brilliant. The German army spent the winter retraining and re-equipping for the attack that would come in the spring. The Phony War was not peace. It was the calm before the storm, the silence before the scream. And when the storm finally broke, the world would never be the same. A deliberate war. The Phony War would not last forever. On May 10th, 1940, the Germans launched their offensive in the west. Within 6 weeks, France would be defeated. The British army would be driven from the continent at Dunkirk, and Hitler would stand on the Channel coast, looking out at the sea that separated him from his last remaining enemy. The war that had begun as a deliberate strategy, planned and prepared for years, was about to enter its most dramatic phase. But by the time the guns fell silent in 1945, more than 60 million people would be dead. Cities would lie in ruins. Empires would have crumbled. The world would have changed forever. Looking back across the years from 1919 to 1939, the pattern is unmistakable. This was not a war that happened by accident. It was not a series of unfortunate events that spiraled out of control. It was a war that was chosen, planned, and executed by a regime that had made its intentions clear from the very beginning. Adolf Hitler wrote his plans in Mein Kampf in 1925. He laid them out for his generals at the Hossbach Conference in 1937. He pursued them through the Rhineland, Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Poland. Every step was a step toward the war he always intended to fight. The rest of the world watched and hoped and made excuses. They told themselves that Hitler could be satisfied, that his demands were reasonable, that peace could be preserved if only they gave him what he wanted. They were wrong. Hitler did not want peace. He wanted war. He wanted living space in the East. He wanted domination of the European continent. He wanted a 1,000-year Reich that would stand as a monument to his own twisted vision. And he was willing to burn the world to get it. The Phony War was the last pause before the nightmare truly began. But it was only a pause. When the Germans finally turned west in the spring of 1940, they unleashed a fury that had been building for years. The Battle of France, the evacuation at Dunkirk, the Battle of Britain, the Blitz, the invasion of the Soviet Union, the Holocaust, the war in the Pacific, the atomic bomb. All of it flowed from the decisions made in those years between the wars. The deliberate strategy of one man and one regime had set in motion events that would shape the course of the 20th century and beyond. As we close this chapter, we are left with the question that haunts all history. What if? What if the Western powers had resisted in the Rhineland? What if they had stood by Czechoslovakia at Munich? What if Stalin had not signed the pact? But the past cannot be changed. It can only be understood. And to understand why Germany started World War II is to understand that it was not an accident, not a mistake, not a tragedy that simply happened. It was a choice. It was the most consequential choice of the 20th century, and the world has lived with its consequences ever since. If you made it this far, thanks for watching, and make sure to smash both the like and hype buttons and subscribe to our channel for more ominous history videos. We greatly appreciate your support. See you in the next video.